Today you're going to be looking at complex numbers, the rest of section 4-8. The objective we're going to do is to identify and perform operations with complex numbers and to find complex number solutions of quadratic equations. Let's first take a look at what a complex number is. A complex number is a plus bi. A is called the real part, or the real number. Bi is called the imaginary part, or your imaginary number. So let's perform some operations. Let's start with adding and subtracting. When you add together complex numbers, you add real parts with real parts and imaginary parts with imaginary parts. So if we do 4 plus negative 4, we get 0, and negative 3i plus 3i is also 0, or 0i, and this will make a total of 0 for the answer. Let's look at subtracting. Same thing. When you subtract the real part from the real part, and you subtract the imaginary part from the imaginary part. So if we do 5 minus negative 2, that will make 7, because minus and negative becomes plus positive. Then you do negative 3i minus 4i makes a negative 7i. And that would be your final answer, because you cannot add together or subtract a real number from an imaginary number. Now let's take a look at multiplying. When multiplying imaginary numbers, you can multiply imaginary numbers with real numbers and imaginary numbers with imaginary numbers. So here we're going to distribute 3i. 3i times negative 5 makes negative 15i. So you do 3 times negative 5 to get the negative 15 and carry down the I. Then we do 3i times 2i. So 3 times 2 makes a positive 6. And then I times I makes I squared. We learned yesterday that I squared is the equivalent of negative 1. Remember always that I squared equals negative 1. So when you have an I squared, you replace it with negative 1. So it becomes negative 15i plus 6 times negative 1, where I squared gets replaced with negative 1, making this a negative 6. Imaginary numbers or complex numbers are always written in the form a plus bi. The real part comes first, imaginary part comes second. So we rewrite this as negative 6 minus 15i. Let's look at another multiplication. This time we have two parentheses that we're going to multiply. So we do 4 times negative 1, and we get negative 4. Then we do 4 times negative 2i, and we get negative 8i. So keep distributing. We're going to do 3i times negative 1 and get negative 3i, and then 3i times negative 2i and get negative 6i squared. It's a lot like FOIL. First, outside, inside, last. Same concept. Now we can combine together our like terms, and also I squared needs to be replaced with negative 1. So it becomes negative 4 minus 11i plus 6, because we have a negative 6 times a negative 1 in place of the I squared. Combine like terms one more time, and you get 2 minus 11i. And that would be your final answer. Let's look at one more. This time we have 5 minus I squared. This means 5 minus I times 5 minus I. So we have to FOIL again. So we do first 5 times 5 and get 25. Then outside 5 times negative I and get negative 5i. Inside negative I times 5 and we get another negative 5i. And then last, which is negative I times negative I, makes a positive I squared. Combine our like terms and replace I squared with negative 1. So now we have 25 minus 10i minus 1, where I squared got replaced with negative 1. Combine like terms one more time, and the final answer would be 24 minus 10i. Now let's look at finding all solutions. We're going to solve these quadratic equations. If we do 3 times 2, we get 6. But there are no factors of positive 6 that will make negative 1. So we have to use the quadratic formula. So we're going to start by identifying A as 3, B as negative 1, and C as 2. And we plug into our quadratic formula. Negative b, which becomes 1, plus or minus the square root of negative 1 squared minus 4 times 3 times 2 all over 2 times 3. Now we go through and do our math. So we get 1 plus or minus the square root of. First thing we're going to do is negative 1 squared to give us 1. Carry down our minus. 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 2 is 24. All over 6. So now we have x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of negative 23 over 6. Because we have a negative in here in the square root, it gets to come out as I, making the final answer 1 plus or minus I square root 23 over 6. Any negatives in a square root get taken out as an I, making the entire answer imaginary. Let's look at number 2. Once again, there are no factors of positive 5 that will make negative 4. Since negative 4 is an even number and there's no number in front of x squared, we can choose to complete the square. To complete the square, we'll start by subtracting 5 to both sides. And we get x squared minus 4x plus box equals negative 5 plus box. Remember, to find box, we need to do c equals negative 4 over 2 squared, which becomes 4. So we put 4 in here and 4 in here. So now the factors of 4 that make negative 4 would be negative 2 and negative 2. So it factors as x minus 2 squared equals negative 1, because negative 5 plus 4 makes negative 1. To solve, we'll take the square root of both sides. As we learned, the square root of negative 1 equals I. Remember, every square root gets plus or minus, so it becomes plus or minus I. Then we add 2 to both sides, and we find that x equals 2 plus or minus I. You could also solve number 2 using the quadratic formula. You will just have more simplifying to do. Now that the lesson is complete, go make sure to print your assignment for 4-8 and try those problems using these notes. Refer back to this video if you need help.